सहस्रशीर्षा पुरुषः सहस्राक्षः सहस्रपात् स भूमिं विश्वतो कृत्वा हस्यति खद्दशाङ्गुलम् पुरुष एवेति.
Thank you for tuning in to Light of the Vedas. This is your host, Sri Sachinandana Das. In our previous episodes, we discussed how the Yajur Veda, the one Veda, it originates within the Omkar, and the various great sages and rishis, they enter into meditation and they pull the mantras of the Vedas out of the Om. And those mantras are then brought into human society and used for sacrifice. And we discussed Vedic culture, which really begins with the conception, the consciousness of the parents, and then one moves through various samskars, or purificatory rituals, through childhood and then through marriage, and ultimately ending in the funeral rite, and how one's life is predominated by a performance of sacrifice and study, and the ultimate goal of life is enlightenment. We also discussed the various yugas, or gigantic time cycles, in which the human consciousness moves from pure, exalted consciousness towards a materialistic consciousness. And human society begins, essentially, people are sages and rishis living in the forests and the mountains, performing deep meditation upon the Omkar. And then gradually, as time moves on, they sort of leave these hermitages and begin performing sacrifice. In societies, one of priests, using the Veda for ritualistic performances that purify the consciousness. And then gradually, as time goes on and society becomes more materialistic, then human society becomes more complex. You have the different classes of men, the priestly class, the warrior and administrative class, the kings. And then you have the farmers and businessmen and also the workers. And so society stratifies according to the various qualities of individuals and their personalities, their abilities, and their tendencies towards work. And so you develop a much more complex society. And along with this complexity, there's a gradual decline in consciousness. And then begins the age of Kali, and we're considered to be living about approximately 5,000 years into the age of Kali. So 3000 BC is when it began, according to the Vedic texts. And so this is a time when human consciousness begins to degrade very severely into materialism. And previously, human beings being engaged in spiritual practice, and especially in meditation, they were very capable. Not only were they capable in doing things within the world, but they had a very powerful memory. In fact, at that time, the Vedas were not written down. They were simply memorized and passed down from word of mouth, generation after generation. So the intelligence was very strong. And also, individuals had a much higher level of psychic ability because they're absorbed in meditation. The more you meditate and the more you absorb in spiritual practices, the greater your capacity to sort of access more subtle truths about reality becomes. You develop psychic abilities. You can understand reality from a much higher level of consciousness. And so you might say, because human society was much more spiritually conscious, the human body itself adapted to that consciousness and was a powerful receptacle of spiritual consciousness. It's kind of like a soul within a human body in those previous ages could shine out more clearly through that body. Just like if you have a light bulb that is clean and clear and new, the light shines from it very clearly. But then as human society degrades and the consciousness turns less from meditation and more into materialistic endeavor, it becomes covered sort of like by dust, by rajas. It becomes covered by lust and anger and greed and sort of lower qualities. As the human beings become, they begin to endeavor into materialism. And then the consciousness is less able to shine out through that particular body. So there's a sense in which the human body has degraded over many, many generations of materialism. And so the human body becomes kind of an obstacle to spiritual life. And the soul within the human body is shining through thick layers of sort of ignorance and dust and many different desires, right? Like lust, anger, and greed. Our bodies are filled with it because for many thousands of generations, mankind has been absorbed in pursuing those particular goals. So human beings have kind of degraded in their conditioning. And this process continues and continues for another 432,000 years until human beings will be barely recognizable from who we are now. Like the human body is mentioned in the Vedic scriptures to become much smaller, much shorter. Whereas we have lost our memory to a very high degree, they practically won't be able to remember anything. Their intelligence will be very weak. And their ability to do things within the world will be very weak. So, for example, like if you were to somehow enter into the future and be like the only modern person living at the end of this particular age, you would be like almost like a god among them. You would be considered greatly intelligent and greatly capable. They would be shocked, and you'd consider to have a large body that's very strong, right? It's almost like that movie Idiocracy, where it shows a regular guy from today is like considered a genius, and everyone around him is completely foolish. So that's kind of what human society is predicted to become in the Vedas as time moves on. And some people even say, that's happening right before our eyes, right? So generation after generation, as people become more materialistic, they lose their spiritual consciousness and they lose all the qualities that arise from spiritual consciousness. And so about 5,000 years ago or so, the great sage Vyasadeva, who we've discussed already, he recognized the various symptoms of this materialistic age were upon him, right? And that Vedic culture that we've been discussing, he decided that he has to do something out of compassion for all human beings. He wants to preserve the Vedas as much as possible and make sure that they stay within human society as long as possible. And so he decided to write them down. As we mentioned previously, they were memorized, but he could see that people won't be able to do this anymore. And so he decided to write down the Vedas. And furthermore, he decided to divide them up into different portions and then establish spiritual or religious schools, disciplic successions, in order to carry that information into the future. So there in his ashram, in Badrik ashram in the Himalayas, the sage Vyasadeva took upon himself the great work of taking all of those Vedic mantras, which are memorized and passed down through generations, and then writing them down. And so traditionally, when one utilized the Veda to perform ritualistic sacrifices or yajnas, there were 4 different priests involved. There was the Hotri, who was a priest that who would offer the oblations into the sacrifice. If you picture one of these fire sacrifices, you have the fire blazing like a campfire, and one of the priests is offering ghee or clarified butter with a spoon into the fire. And so that's the Hotri. And then you have the Udgata, who's the one who actually chants the mantras. He's the one actually reciting the mantras of the Vedas. And then you have the Advaryo, is a priest who actually, he's there and he kind of watches over the sacrifice and makes sure that the sacrifice is going properly. He listens to all the mantras, makes sure everything is done according to the rules. If there's a mistake, he'll stop it and they'll back up and go again. And so he's kind of in charge, making sure that all the formulas are performed properly. And then also you have the Purohita, or the Brahmana, who he is there. He's sort of familiar with different magical spells and things like that are utilized in the sacrifice, especially to protect the sacrifice and to make sure that it goes on properly. So these 4 different priests were used in all the Vedic sacrifices. And so when Vyasadeva, when he divided the Vedas and wrote them down, he divided them up sort of in accordance with the 4 priests. So the Rig Veda is associated with the Hotri priest. The Sama Veda is associated with the Ugatri, and then the Yajur Veda is associated with the Advaryu, and then finally the Atharva Veda is associated with the Purohita. And so in this way he divided the Vedas into 4 according to the 4 different types of priests. So the Rig Veda, it's a compilation of prayers to the gods. If you ever get a chance to take a look at it, it's a very long scripture. It's very difficult to understand. It's a very ancient form of Sanskrit. But basically you're offering prayers to various gods such as Indra and Agni and Varuna and Mitra. And the idea here with these sacrifices is they weren't just rituals. It was like you're actually inviting the gods down, and you're inviting them almost to a party, and all the different aspects of the Vedas were used in these sort of parties. For example, you have the priests are offering prayers to them and inviting them to come, offering oblations into the fire for them. And there's even like a place set for them to come. And so in previous ages, the idea was, they would actually see, after, performing the ritual properly, they would actually see a god come down, right? And then they would offer him, like to wash his mouth and wash his feet and like welcome him. And they would offer prayers to the god and try to satisfy the god. And then, when the god is satisfied, then they ask for benediction, and sometimes they would also have entertainment, because it's considered the god is right there. So they would have music and art, and they would have theater and all these different things right in the midst of the sacrifice. It wasn't just sort of like a boring sacrifice of people chanting mantras. They had theatrical performances and entertainment going on for the gods. And much of the theater and music and art and dance and all of these things that are there within India or that originate in Vedic culture, they actually come from these sacrifices. And so, and after the sacrifice, the god is then, you say goodbye, right? So it's really you're welcoming sort of like a great personality into your assembly. You're worshiping them and glorifying them and satisfying them, entertaining them, and also feeding them. And then asking for a benediction and saying goodbye. And that's basically what a sacrifice is. So the Rig Veda is the different mantras which are used to praise the god when the god arrives. And the mantras are chanted in a certain meter known as svaras. It's basically of the 7 notes, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Then the svaras are composed of 4 notes. And so the chanter will go up and down in their chanting amidst these 4 notes. And here is an example of this. It's a small portion of the Purusha Sukta from the Rig Veda. So after writing down the Rig Veda, then Vyasadeva, this great sage, he gave it to one of his leading disciples, Paila Rishi. And Paila Rishi began his school of the Rig Veda. And gradually that school branched into 21 different schools. And of those 21 schools, of course it's been many thousands of years, but surprisingly 5 are actually still left. And these schools established by Paila Rishi, then they would sort of elaborate upon the text. They would memorize the text of the Rig Veda, and then they would also, from within that Veda, they would pull out other texts, such as Brahmanas, which again are the texts which deal with how to perform sacrifices. And then the Aranyakas, which are texts you might find in the Rig Veda, which deal with sort of an elaboration or the esoteric metaphysical meaning behind those sacrifices. And then there's Upanishads associated with the various texts of the Vedas, which deal more specifically with the absolute truth. So these schools would sort of extract these different elements from their particular Veda, and then they would expound upon them and study them very carefully. And so some portions of these literature would deal with, as we mentioned in the previous podcast, the life of sacrifice. They would, each particular school would have its own samskars or rituals that one performs throughout their life for purification. And each particular school has, its own sort of variation on how to perform the various sacrifices of the Vedas. And so one moves progressively through their life, having a family, having children, having an occupation. And so a certain portion of the Vedas will then address that, the Brahmanas and Aranyakas, for example. And then finally you have that section of the literature, those mantras which are pulled out of it, which deal specifically with transcendence, or how to achieve the ultimate gain of life, which is liberation. And then those are the Upanishads. And so the particular Vedic schools that come down through time, they have their own Upanishads, and many of the famous names of the Upanishads actually come from the name of the school. For example, you have the Taittiriya Shaka, or the Taittiriya school. It gives its name to the Taittiriya Upanishad. Or the Kaushutaki school gives its name to the Kaushutaki Upanishad. And so many of the Upanishads, which form the backbone of spiritual study and understanding the absolute truth within the Vedic culture, which are very influential within the various schools of philosophy, they originate within the Vedic texts. For example, the Yajurveda, within the text of the Yajurveda, you have the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Isha Upanishad, the Taittiriya Upanishad, the Katha Upanishad, the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, which are still studied very carefully today, and they're super important. So they come down to us, they're sort of brought out of that text, and then come down to us through these different schools, these shakas. And a shaka means a branch. Just like if you have a tree without leaves, and it's reflected on a lake or something like that, an upside-down tree. So similarly, this tree of the Vedas, its trunk originates in Vyas, the sage Vyas, and it comes down into many, many hundreds and thousands of branches. So these are called shakas, or schools. And it's through these schools that the Vedas come down to us. So when you look at Hinduism, or you look at Vedic culture, this is just the remnant of what was passed down through these shakas. And originally the Vedic literature, as Vyasadeva wrote it down, was immense. There was actually 4,420 different texts, and now there's only 6% of that is left. So over 5,000 years, it's diminished to where there's just a small portion left, but it's from that portion, which even to this day is diminishing, that we get the Vedic culture as we know it. So in the same way that Vyasadeva wrote down the Rig Veda, or that portion of the Veda which is to be the Rig Veda, and gave it to his disciple Pila, so he also did that with the Sama Veda, and he gave it to his disciple Jaimini Rishi. And so Jaimini Rishi was very productive. He established 1,000 schools. And the Sama Veda is essentially the Rig Veda set to music. It's the same prayers as the Rig Veda, but then instead of chanting it in only 4 notes, it's being chanted in all 7 notes. And so it's being sung, and it's being accompanied by music and oftentimes by dance performances. So as we said, when you chant these mantras and you bring down the gods and welcome them, you throw them a party. And so those same mantras of prayer are then sung as a song to the gods, and there's dancing and there's art, and there's various cultural exhibitions for the pleasure of the exalted guest. And so, and this is actually the origin of Gandharva Veda, or the science of music and dance within the Vedic culture. And so of those 1,000 schools, only 12 are left. And this was the Veda that was used by the Udgatri, or the individual who's chanting while the sacrifice is being performed, that particular priest. And so similarly, that portion of the Vedas which was used by the Advaryu, that priest who kind of watches over the sacrifice and makes sure everything is done properly, that was then brought out and written down by Vyas as the Yajurveda. And that was handed to his disciple Vaishampayan, and he established 100 schools. And so the Yajurveda, it's basically like a list of the various sacrifices that one can perform. There's the Agnihotra sacrifice, which is kind of like the small daily sacrifice that individuals will perform in their home. There's other larger sacrifices that may be performed on a regular basis, such as the Dasha Purnima and the Soma Yajna. And then there's big royal sacrifices like the Ashvamedha. And it describes how to do these things. For example, the Ashvamedha sacrifice, essentially a king has to be declared an emperor before he can do it, a samrat. And so he'll take the horse. There's a special sort of like royal horse which is chosen, and it wanders throughout the various kingdoms of the world, and wherever it wanders, his army follows. And the army will, request that the local king will submit to the emperor, and if they don't, then they'll fight, right? And so in this way, following the horse, the army will subjugate all the other kingdoms around, and then once everyone recognizes his supreme authority, then he can perform this particular sacrifice. And so there's all these very famous sacrifices that were performed in the Vedic culture, and they're there within the Yajur Veda. And so the Yajur Veda, it's divided into two sections. There's the Shukla and Krishna Yajur Veda, the black and the white Yajur Veda. And so the black Yajur Veda, it's kind of like the mantras, or sort of everything is mixed together and the Vedas disorganized in a certain way. And then the white, the Shukla Yajur Veda, is that it's the same thing, but essentially the mantras are organized very nicely. And so from these two different versions, the Shukla Yajur Veda and the Krishna Yajur Veda, all these different schools come down. And of these schools, these 100 schools, 86 of them are left. And the Yajur Veda is also associated with the Dhanar Veda, or sort of like the military arts within the Vedic culture, as well as the Sthapatya, the architectural arts, like how to build temples, how to construct the arena of sacrifice, how to build the kunda, or the place, where the sacrifice will be performed. All of this is done according to very strict ritualistic rules. And so also as well the Shilpa Shastra, the scriptures dealing with how to create sacred images or deities, and sculpting in general, and art in general. These things come from the Yajur Veda. And then finally there's the Atharva Veda. So Srila Vyasadeva wrote this Atharva Veda down and then gave it to his disciple Angira. And Angira established 9 different schools. And the Atharva Veda is basically magical spells, like it's many different things. There's all sorts of stuff in there, including like religious medicine, mantras to cure people and things like that of diseases, but also mantras for protection, like protection of the sacrifice. For example, if a female Rakshasa or demon attacks the sacrifice, you can chant these mantras and offer grains into the fire, and the demon will be expelled, right? So there's kind of like the exorcism of the sacrificial arena, and the healing of anyone, who may need to be healed, right? Using mantras and using different forms of ritual. And so you have all sorts of prayers and magical chants. And of these Atharva Veda schools, of the 9 schools, 9 are left. So according to the Kurma Purana, in the beginning of these Vedic schools, there was 1,130 branches. And so as we said, just a small portion of a few of these schools are left. And along with these Vedas, there are also different literatures known as the Vedangas and the Upavedas, the Kalpa Sutras, Griha Sutras. These different types of scriptures, they deal with sort of like basic educational things, like, for example, how to pronounce the mantras, how to properly chant them, and how to perform the sacrifices, how to write, like the whole science of grammar, as well as dictionary, like what are a whole compendium of the various Sanskrit words. And then also included within these Vedangas is astronomy and astrology, which were used in performing sacrifice. So, whenever a sacrificial arena is being constructed and whenever a sacrifice is being performed, they pay very close attention to the movements of the stars, and everything is going to be timed perfectly. And it's a very important part of the ritual. It has to be done at exactly this particular astronomical time, and these planets have to be exactly positioned here or there. And so there's various rigorous rules about that. And so the priests were expected to understand astronomy and astrology. In fact, they even had astronomical viewing towers and things like that just for that purpose. So most of the sciences, including grammar and art and all these different things, they actually come from this practice of sacrifice. And also the priests would have to learn to chant the meters properly. This was considered very, very important. In fact, there's many instances in the stories of the Puranas, etc., where it's like someone may mispronounce a particular mantra while chanting, and it will have a horrible effect. Somebody means to summon, somebody's trying to summon a demon to kill someone or to attack a god or something like that, and they mispronounce one particular syllable, or the syllable is meant to be chanted for a certain length of time, like 2 seconds, but they chant the syllable for 1 second instead, and then all of a sudden, instead of having a demon being born to kill the god, you have like a god being born to kill a demon or something like that. There'll be like a total twisting of the meaning. So it's very, these it's kind of like these rituals are very technical. And just as we put, in modern society, we put so much emphasis on putting together machinery and, sort of like engineering things, houses and buildings and technology in a very careful, precise, mathematical way. So similarly in Vedic culture, they applied their own sort of technical nature into performing sacrifice. And just as we, say you're building like you're colliding atoms against each other in one of these gigantic colliders. So, the mathematical precision has to be very, very careful. They're trying to get a certain fruit from their work, and they have to do everything very precisely in order to get that. So it's the same thing in the Vedic culture. They're technocrats, like they're really working very hard in almost like a scientific way to perform these rituals very, very carefully, and then down to the pronunciation has to be extremely proper, and there can be no mistakes. So it's like you're applying this kind of scientific approach to ritual, and the idea is that you're going to interact with the gods, and if you do it properly, you're going to get a result. So this is sort of like how they applied their tendencies towards materialism. If they wanted some material thing, they would approach the gods. But the way they approached it was with extreme technical precision and like a very, you might say, in order for these rituals to work right, they have to be perfect. Otherwise, they're not going to be accepted by the gods, and there's going to be no result. And oftentimes, there's a tremendous amount of money put into it. There's like gold ornaments, the gold plates, and all the different instruments of sacrifice are made of gold, and there's so many donations of cows have to be made during the sacrifice. And so there's a lot of money riding on it as well. Like if you somehow make a mistake, then you're sort of like wasting all of this energy and effort and money that you're putting into the sacrifice. And so the individuals performing the sacrifice had to be trained very carefully in these various sciences, these Upavedas and Vedangas, which are supporting the whole system of sacrifice. It's like making them expert at performing. They're highly educated in being expert at performing these sacrifices, so that when they perform them, they're performed right and there'll actually be a result. And so most of these sacrifices, they're not performed today, specifically because there's nobody qualified to do them. No one is trained up in the Vedangas. They're not trained in grammar and pronunciation and meter, nor do they have the personal qualifications of purity that are required. I mean, the qualifications for purity begin even before you're born. Like your parents have to conceive you in proper consciousness for you to be able to perform these sacrifices. So because most of these qualifications aren't there, therefore these Vedic sacrifices have basically stopped. I think the last Samaveda sacrifice was performed sometime in the 1980s. And there's like a very strict way in which priests are supposed to train up the future generation. And so nobody was trained up. It was basically, they couldn't hand the priesthood to perform the ritual properly anymore because too few people were being trained up. So there's a lack of interest as well. And so over time, that takes its toll. And gradually you have nobody qualified to perform the sacrifice. So most of these sacrifices have stopped for that reason. So thank you very much for listening. If you found value in this, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please visit srisachinandana.com/iTunes and leave a positive review. Thank you again, and we hope you'll join us next time on Light of the Vedas.